Tears streamed down my son's face as he stood outside our front door, backpack hanging off one shoulder, trembling in confusion while a stocky man in a security uniform barked into a walkie-talkie. His voice was too loud, too confident for someone who didn't even know what he was about to step into. My son, just 13, had tried to come home from school like any other day, only to be stopped by this overzealous HOA security guard claiming he was unauthorized to enter his own home. I had just returned from an overseas counterterrorism assignment and was pulling up the driveway in my unmarked black SUV when I saw it all unfold. The guard squared his shoulders, clearly emboldened by the flimsy authority his uniform gave him, and pointed to the sidewalk like he was directing traffic at a concert. I stepped out of my vehicle slowly, locking eyes with the man. He had no idea that I was a Homeland Security Commander, and that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by turning my kid into collateral damage in his little HOA power trip. I walked toward them calmly, each step deliberate, my boots crunching against the driveway gravel. My son saw me and choked out a sob, pointing back at the guard. The man raised a hand at me, palm out, as if I were just another suburban dad who needed to be put in his place. I asked what the problem was, my voice even, barely masking the steel underneath. The guard, not even glancing at my government ID badge clipped to my belt, informed me that the HOA had implemented a new rule that minors were not allowed into the neighborhood without direct supervision from a registered resident. My son lived here. He had a key. He was trying to get into his own home. The guard waved that off, saying he hadn't seen him enter before and that I'd need to submit a formal request if I wanted my son to have access. Formal request? For my own kid? To enter my own house? The absurdity of it would have been funny if it hadn't made my son feel like a criminal. I told the guard he was making a mistake. He smirked and told me to take it up with the HOA president. Then, in a tone laced with the arrogance of someone who had never been challenged, he warned that continued interference would result in a citation. He looked at me like he was doing me a favor. I could have pulled rank right there. Shown him the badge. Said the words that would make his whole foundation of self-importance crack into rubble. But I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole of stupidity went. After getting my son inside and comforting him, I sat in my home office and pulled up the latest HOA newsletter. Sure enough, buried on page 5, was a clause about minor resident escort requirements. It hadn't been passed through a vote. There was no record of community approval. Just an arbitrary enforcement dictated by a woman named Gretchen Voss, the self-appointed HOA president who had, according to neighbors, become increasingly unhinged over the past 6 months. She had brought in a private security firm named Eagle Eye Enforcement, branding them as the community's new watchful guardians. According to their online presence, they were former security mall staff and nightclub bouncers. No proper training, no state license, and zero background in real law enforcement. I made a few calls. Quiet ones. Professional ones. I didn't use my title. Not yet. I asked my colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security to pull any documentation on Eagle Eye Enforcement. They came back with red flags and questions. The company was a shell corporation with multiple registered addresses, most of which were empty strip mall boxes. The director listed was Gretchen's cousin. Their payroll came from HOA fees that had spiked mysteriously 2 quarters ago. I began to piece together a puzzle that painted the entire operation as not only morally outrageous but potentially criminal. That evening, I walked my neighborhood with a quiet purpose. Several residents approached me, some whispering, others with visible irritation. One older woman, Mrs. Langston, who had lived here since the subdivision was built, told me the same guard had harassed her for having her niece park a few minutes too long outside her home. A younger father told me his daughter had been stopped and searched for rollerblading too close to the clubhouse. All of them were angry, but none had known what to do. Karen, the neighborhood nickname for Gretchen, had slapped fines, held surprise board meetings, and hired these rent-a-cops to rule by fear. Back at home, I installed 2 micro-surveillance cams. One pointed at the HOA gate and another at the clubhouse entrance. I wanted to gather clear proof of abuse, not just anecdotal stories. My son watched me do this, still shaken. I could tell he was questioning why I hadn't already shut it all down. Why I hadn't made that guard disappear the moment he raised his voice. I crouched down beside him and told him, sometimes justice needs to be seen to be believed. That's when I showed him a small framed picture on my desk. It was me, standing in Kabul, behind a line of agents, as we had just completed a hostage rescue mission. I told him I didn't raise my voice then either. I just made the right call when the time was right. That night, I stared at my screen as the cameras transmitted live feed. At exactly 9 p.m., the guard from earlier strutted down the sidewalk, shining his flashlight through parked car windows. He peered into one vehicle, then tapped on a house door, barking about a trash can being left 6 inches from regulation placement. He wasn't protecting the community. He was playing dictator. At 9:17 p.m., another guard frisked a high school kid who had just walked back from a friend's house, claiming he matched a loitering suspect. I hit record. The next morning, I placed the clips into a shared drive titled HOA Incident Package. I drafted an email to an old friend, Special Agent Thomas Cutter, at the Department of Justice. Subject line read, "Potential abuse of private security powers in civilian neighborhood." I attached the videos, added context, and signed off without my title. Cutter would know who I was. He'd understand the gravity. I didn't need rank to get attention. The facts would speak for themselves. And soon, so would I. The guard had humiliated my son. Gretchen had built a kingdom of fear. The HOA had created an illusion of power, thinking no one would challenge them. But the thing about illusions is, once exposed to light, they shatter. This one was about to explode. The next morning, I received a reply from Cutter. It was brief, which meant he was already moving. He simply wrote, confirmed. Ongoing history of complaint. Sending a contact to coordinate. Eyes open. I knew Cutter's style. No fluff, all purpose. It was exactly what I needed to kick off what I had silently dubbed Operation Suburb Shield. But before I could make any formal moves, I needed more context, more proof, and a deeper understanding of how the HOA's madness had managed to entangle so many people without consequence. So I did what every intelligence officer learns to do best before the operation begins. I listened. I spent the day walking the neighborhood again, this time more carefully. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a quiet investigator in plain clothes. I spoke to a retired Marine named Carlos who lived 4 houses down. He said he had been threatened with a fine for flying an American flag on a non-approved pole. Another resident, a young single mother named Jada, said the security guards followed her teenage son whenever he skateboarded, claiming he was disturbing the peace even though he wore noise-canceling headphones. An elderly couple admitted they had stopped inviting their grandchildren over because the guards gave the kids intimidating looks and asked invasive questions like whether their parents were divorced or if they were vaccinated. It was more than overreach. It was harassment, layered with delusion and sanctioned by a leadership that had no idea what true authority looked like. Later that afternoon, I reviewed the HOA meeting minutes, which I found posted deep inside a poorly organized online portal only accessible after 3 levels of verification. Buried between budget adjustments and landscaping updates were notes that made my blood boil. The HOA board had recently voted to increase monthly dues under the guise of community security modernization. The funds were funneled into extended contracts with eagle eye enforcement and surveillance equipment that had been mounted without public notice. According to the logs, Gretchen herself approved the expenditures without full board consensus. More interestingly, the security company's invoices were inflated, suspiciously vague, and signed by someone named Russ Voss, clearly a relative. I printed them all. These would be useful later, not only as evidence but as the start of a financial trail that could unravel this entire farce. That evening, I received a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man in plain clothes, sharp-eyed, with a military cut and a calm presence. He introduced himself only as Gibbs, Cutter's field contact. I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. Once inside, he dropped a black satchel on my dining table, opened it, and revealed a thin file marked with the DHS insignia. Inside were printed complaints, citizen affidavits, unlicensed activity reports on Eagle Eye enforcement, and most importantly, photos of previous HOA security incidents that had not been filed with the county. Gibbs looked me in the eye and said, "We've been watching this firm. Your footage confirms they're extending operations illegally into areas we've warned them about. We're going to move, but we need a civilian-facing case. You're in the best position to anchor it." I nodded. I already knew my role. I'd lived my career gathering intelligence on terror cells, traffickers, and rogue foreign operative. This HOA may have looked suburban, but its leadership operated with the same unchecked power and careless arrogance I'd seen topple real governments. Gibbs left as quietly as he came, but before he disappeared into the street, he handed me a burner phone and said, "When it's time, call the number under Falcon. He'll know what to do." I pocketed it and returned to my son, who had been watching cartoons but whose face lit up when he saw me. I sat beside him and told him tomorrow we'd go for ice cream. I needed to remind him that amidst all of this, he was still a kid and deserved to feel safe, not like a hostage in his own neighborhood. The next day, I reviewed the camera footage again and noticed something new. At 4 p.m., a group of children had stopped near the clubhouse on their bike. The guard approached, said something, and pointed toward the sidewalk. One kid protested, and the guard grabbed his handlebars, causing the bike to tip. The child fell. No major injuries, but the guard didn't help. He stood over the kid like a bouncer at a club. I couldn't hear audio, but the image alone was enough. That was it. I uploaded the clip to a private link and forwarded it to Gibbs. No reply came, which meant it was already in the system and being handled. Later that afternoon, I got a message through the burner phone. The text simply read, "HOA board meeting tonight. Presence advised." Wear a smile. I didn't need to be told twice. I put on my cleanest polo shirt, jeans, and boots, the kind of outfit that made me look like just another dad, and walked over to the clubhouse. The meeting was already underway when I entered. Karen, Gretchen Voss, stood at the front in a peach-colored pantsuit and a tone that could peel paint off a wall. She was ranting about property uniformity and how allowing unregistered children to enter the neighborhood without scanned ID cards was a gateway to juvenile crime. I stood at the back, arms crossed, letting her dig her own grave. After about 10 minutes, I raised my hand. She recognized me with visible hesitation. I introduced myself, thanked her for the floor, and then calmly asked what authority she had to implement federal-level entry procedures in a private, family-owned residential neighborhood. She scoffed and started quoting bylaws. I interrupted, asking where in the community charter it authorized pat-downs, vehicle searches, or denial of access to legal residents under the age of 18. She deflected, claiming emergency measures. I stepped forward, reached into my pocket, and placed one of the printed invoices on the podium. "Do you recognize this signature?" I asked, loud enough for the room to hear. She looked, and her mouth twitched. Several board members leaned in, eyebrows rising. Then I added, "Because the Department of Justice does." Gasps followed. A board member coughed. Karen tried to regain control, saying this was slander, that she'd report me to the authorities. I leaned in and said softly, "I am the authorities." Then I smiled, exactly as the text advised. I left the meeting without another word. I didn't need to stay. What happened next was already in motion. Within the hour, residents would start whispering. Within the day, they'd begin to question their dues. And within the week, the entire neighborhood would be a different battlefield. Only this time, it wasn't the HOA who held the power. It was the people. And they had just discovered their best weapon was the quiet man who had always walked among them, unassuming, but watching everything. By the next morning, everything had shifted. The atmosphere in the neighborhood wasn't just tense, it was charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks open the sky. People were whispering on sidewalks, huddling near mailboxes, texting in group chats with usernames I had never seen until screenshots began making their way to my inbox. One particularly bold message read, "Who is the tall guy who roasted Karen at the meeting? Is he FBI or something?" Another one, forwarded anonymously, said, "Karen's shaking, something's going down." I didn't respond to any of them. Silence was more effective than any confirmation, and doubt was my most useful ally. My son walked to school that day with a little more confidence, and when he came home, he told me the guards hadn't looked his way once. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They were rattled. No longer feeling untouchable. But rattled men in borrowed authority were often the most dangerous. So I kept the cameras rolling and the data flowing. Meanwhile, I received a second message from the burner phone. It was just 2 words: prepare sweep. I knew what that meant. The Department of Homeland Security wasn't coming to negotiate. They weren't here to lecture or mediate. They were coming with warrants, task forces, and an ironclad understanding of exactly how to dismantle a corruption structure that had hidden under the veil of neighborhood order. But before that happened, there was one more piece I needed to push into place. The HOA newsletter, released every Friday, was due the next morning, and I had a copy of the template courtesy of a concerned board member who had finally had enough. I added a small paragraph into the digital draft, disguising it as a note from the Community Oversight Subcommittee. It read, "Residents are advised to expect temporary government presence during upcoming audits of security contractors. Please remain calm. Cooperation ensures safety." It was vague enough to seem boring but direct enough to spark quiet panic. That evening, I walked past the clubhouse and noticed the guards huddled together, talking more animatedly than usual. One was on his phone, the other was pointing toward a sheet of paper pinned inside the clubhouse window, the very newsletter they'd probably never read until now. Karen wasn't in sight, which was unusual. She usually hovered like a hawk during these evening patrols. I suspected she was on the phone with her cousin, trying to untangle what she thought was a misunderstanding. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an intervention. And tomorrow morning they'd see just how real it was. I barely slept that night. I reviewed every folder, backed up every file, checked camera batteries, verified GPS tags, and loaded every relevant clip into encrypted storage. At 6 a.m., the first unmarked black SUV rolled into the neighborhood. I recognized the subtle armored chassis beneath the stock shell. A second one followed, then a dark van parked near the utility building. I opened the burner phone, clicked the contact marked Falcon, and sent one word: confirmed. At exactly 7:04 a.m., the sweep began. It started quietly. One DHS agent approached the guard shack, flashed a badge, and requested the staff step out. One complied. The other, the same man who had blocked my son, hesitated and started calling Karen. His phone was confiscated seconds later. A second team walked into the HOA office and handed sealed envelopes to the staff inside. Subpoenas, search warrants, legal requests for digital and financial record. Karen burst out onto the walkway in a bathrobe, screaming about property rights and privacy violations, demanding they leave immediately. The lead agent said nothing. He simply handed her a folder marked with her name and the Department of Justice insignia. I stood from across the street, coffee in hand, just another neighbor watching the show unfold. Residents began pouring out of their homes in bathrobes and slippers, recording on their phones, whispering in awe. A few people clapped. Someone shouted, "Finally!" One of the guards was put in handcuffs after refusing to surrender his weapon, which he wasn't even licensed to carry. Another tried to disappear around the corner but was escorted into a vehicle by 2 DHS officers within minutes. Karen kept yelling, her voice getting higher and less coherent. She demanded that someone call the mayor, the governor, the police, anyone. She told the agents that the HOA was a sovereign entity, that they had the right to secure their own neighborhood. The DHS agent she confronted just nodded, then gestured to the row of unmarked vans and said, "Ma'am, we are the government." That line would later be quoted on social media and local news stories as the moment the neighborhood realized what kind of storm they'd been living under. Within an hour, the HOA office had been emptied. Files were bagged, computers were seized, and residents were interviewed. I was called into the clubhouse, not as a suspect but as the reporting party. I provided my documentation, gave my testimony, and handed over everything from the security cam footage to the invoices I had collected. Gibbs showed up briefly, nodded at me and said, "Nice work. You built the whole case before we even rolled in." That felt good. Not because I wanted praise, but because it confirmed my instincts had been right all along. By noon, the neighborhood looked like a disaster zone wrapped in federal tape. The clubhouse was sealed off. The guard shack was locked. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Word had spread that she had been taken in for questioning and might face charges ranging from illegal surveillance to misuse of community funds and fraudulent contracting. The guards, now exposed as unlicensed and in some cases previously convicted for harassment or assault, were officially banned from returning to the premises. I walked home, my son watching from the porch. He was holding a small American flag. I didn't ask where he got it. He smiled and said, "They're gone, right?" I nodded. Then he asked, "Does this mean I can go to the park again?" I smiled back. "Yeah, buddy. You can go wherever you want. No one's stopping you anymore." That night, the neighborhood held its own unofficial gathering. No one planned it, it just happened. People brought lawn chairs and drinks, someone wheeled over a Bluetooth speaker, and kids ran free on the grass that had once been patrolled like prison turf. I saw residents who hadn't spoken in months laughing together. I saw people thanking one another, shaking hands, comparing notes, hugging. No HOA officers showed up. No guards. No fines. Just people finally feeling safe again. As I looked around, I realized something deeper had changed. It wasn't just the removal of a corrupt board or rogue guard. It was the restoration of dignity. A community that had been kept under fear was breathing again. And they were remembering that power only works if people agree to give it. That night they had taken it back. And all it had taken was one father who refused to let his son cry on the sidewalk ever again. The news coverage didn't take long to catch up. By the following morning, clips of the federal sweep were already circulating on local channels and a few national blogs. Someone had caught the moment when Karen screamed about sovereignty and the DHS agent replied calmly that they were the government. That soundbite alone had gone viral. It was surreal watching the neighborhood I had walked through for years now plastered on television with phrases like power-hungry HOA and illegal civilian enforcement displayed in bold banners across the bottom of the screen. Interviews with shaken residents played on repeat, each one sharing a story of intimidation or financial extortion. The HOA, which had once operated in the shadows of technical bylaws and passive-aggressive newsletters, was now the face of suburban overreach across the country. Inside my house, I monitored the aftermath with a sense of careful detachment. I knew better than to get comfortable. Cleanup operations were often more complicated than the takedown itself. Gibbs texted me with periodic updates, letting me know that Karen had been formally charged with conspiracy to defraud a community association, unauthorized surveillance, and obstruction of justice. The guard who had denied my son access was also being held, pending multiple charges related to unlawful detainment and impersonation of law enforcement. But what really caught my attention was the growing pile of evidence showing how deeply the corruption ran. The HOA had been diverting funds into shell companies for nearly 2 years. HOA dues, inflated without consent, had been rerouted into personal bank accounts under the guise of maintenance projects that never happened. The fake security company was just the surface. Underneath was a complex network of grift that preyed on the assumption that no one would ever question neighborhood governance. It was almost poetic. These people had pretended to enforce order, when in reality they were the chaos. And now they were being dismantled piece by piece under the full weight of federal scrutiny. Still, it wasn't enough to simply watch from afar. I needed to help make sure this neighborhood didn't fall into the same trap again. Power, once abused, tends to attract others looking to inherit it. I wanted to make sure there were safeguards in place. The very next evening, I sent out a digital invitation to all residents, an informal gathering to discuss what came next, hosted on the common green, no official titles allowed. The turnout was bigger than expected. Folding chairs appeared like magic, neighbors brought coolers and snack trays, and for the first time in months, people spoke freely. A retired lawyer offered to help write a new community charter. A local teacher suggested a rotating neighborhood watch made up of actual residents, not outside contractors. Parents spoke up about wanting playgrounds and child-safe zones. One mother broke down in tears talking about how her child had been afraid to ride his bike. And then someone asked me to speak. I stood in front of them, not as a federal officer, but as a father. I told them what had happened to my son. I explained what I had seen and why I had acted. I didn't give them my rank or mention Homeland Security. I didn't need to. The only thing that mattered was that we had been given a second chance, and that second chance needed to be protected by people who understood that community meant more than control. It meant compassion. It meant trust. That night, a vote was taken. Not official yet, but enough to show where the heart of the neighborhood now leaned. Karen was formally removed from her position as president, even before the legal paperwork arrived. An interim board was assembled, made up of longtime residents with no ties to the previous regime. The bylaws were to be rewritten from scratch. No more fine traps, no hidden rule changes, no hired enforcers. Just neighbors taking care of each other. In the days that followed, the federal teams finished their sweep. Equipment was returned, temporary restrictions lifted, and the last of the confiscated files sealed for court use. Gibbs stopped by my house one last time before leaving. He handed me a simple manila envelope containing an official DHS commendation letter for civilian cooperation and intelligence contribution. I tucked it into a drawer without reading it. I hadn't done this for medals. I'd done it for my kid. But there was still one piece of unfinished business. The guard, the one who had humiliated my son, had requested a meeting. It wasn't required, but I agreed, more out of curiosity than compassion. We met in the courthouse visitor room. He looked nothing like the smug man who once blocked a child from entering his own home. He was pale, trembling slightly, dressed in a wrinkled jumpsuit with tired eyes. He apologized. Not just a throwaway line, but a real, stammering, emotional apology. He said he had no idea who I was, which I expected. Then he admitted he had taken the job because it made him feel important after being fired from 3 other ones. He said Karen had told them to push the limits, that residents were lazy and needed discipline. He believed her. Until the morning federal agents put him on the ground and read him his right. I didn't say much. I told him I hoped he learned something, and then I left. As I walked back outside, the sun was setting across the subdivision. The streets were quiet but peaceful, the kind of quiet that comes not from fear, but from relief. My son was waiting for me at the mailbox. He handed me a drawing he'd made in school. It showed our house, surrounded by smiling stick-figure people, and a big sign over the gate that read "Welcome." I took a deep breath and looked around. For the first time in a long time, I believed it. The people here weren't perfect. No community is. But they had seen what unchecked authority could do. They had felt the weight of false power pressed on their back. And now, with everything exposed, they had chosen to build something better. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And as long as that remained true, I would sleep easier at night. Because this time, the guards outside weren't hired hands with fake badges. They were parents watching their kids, veterans walking their dogs, retirees with coffee mugs on their porches. People who knew that power is best used when it's shared, and worst when it's stolen. 2 weeks after the sweep, the neighborhood didn't just look different, it felt different. Where once you might have seen parents glancing nervously over their shoulders or guards prowling on patrol with radios buzzing, now there were kids playing kickball in the street, people walking their dogs in the evening, and porch lights glowing like little signs of peace. The HOA that had once ruled with fines, threats, and intimidation was now a hollow shell, its office shuttered, its leadership under investigation, and its reputation in ruins. But even though the crisis had passed, rebuilding wasn't just about laws and bylaws. It was about people. Trust had to be earned back, step by step, and I intended to help make that happen. One of the first real turning points came when the interim board announced that HOA dues would be paused temporarily until a full financial audit was completed. That announcement alone sent ripples of gratitude through the neighborhood. People who had been quietly struggling to keep up with mysterious charges were suddenly breathing again. It was followed by another major change. Residents would now vote on every major policy proposal, and all meetings would be public and recorded. No more secret amendments slipped into 5-page documents. No more unexplained increases in fees labeled with vague terms like maintenance surcharge. From now on, it was all going to be clear and collective. That Friday, the interim board hosted what they called the Restoration Picnic. It wasn't fancy, just food trucks, music from a Bluetooth speaker, and folding chairs on the clubhouse lawn, which was no longer considered off-limit. There were no guards, no clipboards, no rules about where you could sit or how long your car could be parked. It was simple. It was human. And it was exactly what everyone needed. I brought my son, who at first clung to my side until he saw some of his friends and ran off laughing. Watching him smile without looking over his shoulder every few seconds reminded me why I'd done all this. Not for credit, not for headlines, but for that peace on his face. While the kids played and the adults shared stories over lemonade and grilled kebabs, I was approached by Mrs. Langston, one of the neighborhood's oldest residents. She was the one who had told me early on about the flag incident. She took my hand in hers and said, very simply, that she hadn't felt safe in her own home for months, and that what I did reminded her that not all authority is cruel. Some authority, she said, protects with its strength instead of flexing it. I thanked her and told her the same thing I'd told my son, that sometimes the best weapon in the world is patience, paired with proof. Later that afternoon, someone brought up forming a permanent community council, not a governing body, just a group of volunteers to help with ideas, safety, events, and communication. For the first time, people were excited about participation instead of dreading it. There were no power grabs, no one talking over anyone. People actually listened. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still some disagreements, some skepticism, some old wounds that hadn't healed. But there was a real effort, and that's all I'd ever wanted. Effort from people who wanted to live like neighbors instead of tenants under a regime. That night, when I got home, there was a letter in my mailbox. It had no return address, but I recognized the clean, structured handwriting. Inside was a note from Gibbs. It said simply, "We closed the file today. Officially. But something tells me the story here isn't over. Keep watching. Stay ready. You're good at this." I smiled and folded the note into the same drawer as the commendation letter. I didn't need to hang either one on a wall. Their value wasn't in the paper but in what they represented, doing the right thing when no one else will. The following week, I took a walk around the perimeter of the neighborhood, something I hadn't done in months. It was quiet, peaceful. No more fake patrols. Just the occasional jogger or neighbor pulling weeds in their yard. As I passed the old security shack, I noticed the sign had been taken down. In its place, someone had posted a handmade banner that said, "Welcome Home," in bright, bold letters. Kids had drawn little stick figures and trees across it, and someone had taped a thank you note with my name written at the top. I didn't know who did it. I didn't need to. Just seeing it there was enough. As I reached my driveway, my wife stepped outside holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one and asked if I was ready to finally take a break. I told her the truth. I'd never really take a break, not entirely. Once you've seen how fast things can go wrong, you never stop scanning for the next fire. But for now, for this place, I was ready to breathe. She nodded and kissed my cheek, telling me I deserved a quiet morning for once. And for the first time in a while, I believed her. A few days later, I got a knock on my door from one of the new board members. They offered me a seat on the council, not a leadership role, just a voice. I respectfully declined. Not because I didn't care, but because I wanted this to stay in the hands of the people. I told them I'd always be here to help, but this community had found its strength now, and they didn't need to rely on anyone to fix things for them. They just needed to remember what they were capable of. My son started inviting friends over again. They played video games in the living room, rode their bikes until dusk, and even set up a lemonade stand one weekend. He stopped asking if it was okay to go outside. He just went. That, more than anything, was the victory. That, more than any operation or takedown, was the mission completed. In the weeks that followed, the HOA name was legally changed to the Residence Council. The office was moved from a private building to an open-access room in the community center. Monthly reports were posted on a shared portal, where anyone could comment or offer suggestions. Fines were now reviewed by a neutral third party. The guards were replaced with community volunteers and, occasionally, an off-duty deputy sheriff the county provided once a month. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about protection, about support, about being what a neighborhood is supposed to be. I still walk the neighborhood every evening. Not because I have to, but because I want to. People wave. Kids shout hello. And every now and then, someone stops me and says thank you. I always tell them the same thing. Don't thank me. Thank yourselves. You stood up. You spoke out. You remembered that a house is just wood and stone, but a home, that's built on courage and care. And now, this neighborhood isn't just a place where people live. It's a place where they belong.